December 12th, 1941. Outside the city of Klin, just northwest of Moscow, a German reconnaissance unit stumbled across something that, by all logic, shouldn't have existed. Buried under 2 feet of snow and charred debris was a Soviet T-34 tank, its turret blown half off, tracks torn to ribbons, hull pockmarked with over 40 direct hits. The Germans marked it destroyed in their logs, case closed. But 3 days later, that same tank, hull number 280, rolled back into Soviet lines under its own power. The crew inside had been replaced twice. It had been hit by anti-tank guns, set ablaze, abandoned, recovered, repaired under fire, and driven through a minefield. And it still wouldn't die. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's not propaganda. It's the documented account of one machine that became a legend and the men who refused to let it fall into enemy hands. This is the story of the T-34 that refused to die. Now, before we dive deep into this, you need to understand something about the Eastern Front in 1941. This wasn't just a war. It was an apocalypse on tracks. When Operation Barbarossa kicked off on June 22, 1941, Hitler threw 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and 3,600 tanks at the Soviet Union. The Soviets weren't ready, not even close. In the first weeks, entire armies were encircled, captured, annihilated. Thousands of Soviet tanks, mostly outdated T-26s and BT-7s, were destroyed or abandoned. The Germans were racing toward Moscow, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. But then they started running into the T-34. See, the T-34 wasn't just another tank. It was a revolution wrapped in steel. Designed by Mikhail Koshkin in the late 30s, this thing combined speed, armor, and firepower in a way no other tank in the world had managed. Its sloped armor could deflect German shells that would punch straight through a Panzer III. Its wide tracks let it move through mud and snow that turned German tanks into stuck, helpless targets. And its 76mm gun could tear through German armor at ranges the Germans didn't think were possible. When German tank commanders first encountered the T-34 in the summer of 1941, they were shocked. Their standard 37mm and 50mm guns bounced off the T-34's armor like pebbles off a steel door. They'd fire, see the hit, expect to see the Soviet tank explode, and instead watch it keep coming, firing back with that devastating 76mm cannon. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's best panzer commanders, wrote in his diary after encountering T-34s for the first time. He called it a nasty surprise and admitted that German tank design was suddenly, shockingly obsolete. The T-34 could outrun German tanks on roads, outmaneuver them in mud, outfight them in direct combat. It was faster than a Panzer III, better armored than a Panzer IV, and more reliable than either. And the Soviets were building them by the thousands. But here's the thing. Even the best machine in the world is only as good as the crew inside it, the supply lines behind it, and the luck that keeps it rolling. And in late 1941, the Soviets were running out of all three. The tank production facilities were being evacuated eastward. Entire factories were being loaded onto trains and shipped to the Urals, reassembled in places like Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil. Experienced crews were being killed faster than new ones could be trained. Radio equipment was scarce. Ammunition was running low. Fuel deliveries were irregular. The T-34 was a brilliant design, but brilliance doesn't matter if you can't keep the tanks running, can't train the crews, can't get ammunition to the front. The tank we're talking about today, hull number 280, rolled off the production line at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory in October 1941. By the time it was built, the factory was already preparing to evacuate. The Germans were closing in on Kharkov, and the Soviets were packing up entire factories, machines, workers, blueprints, and shipping them east by rail to the Urals. It was an industrial evacuation on a scale never seen before in human history. Entire cities' worth of machinery moved thousands of kilometers in a matter of weeks. Tank number 280 was one of the last batches to leave before the evacuation. It was loaded onto a flatbed railcar, still smelling of fresh paint and machine oil, shipped north toward Moscow and assigned to the 21st Tank Brigade, a unit that had been formed just weeks earlier and was being thrown directly into the meat grinder. The crew assigned to 280 were young. Most of them were in their early 20s. The commander was a junior lieutenant who'd graduated from a tank academy just 3 months earlier. In peacetime, he'd have spent a year learning tactics, maintenance, leadership. But this wasn't peacetime. The academy had cut its training program from 2 years to 6 months, then to 3 months. They were pushing out officers as fast as they could because officers were dying even faster. The driver was a factory worker from Leningrad who'd been drafted in September. He'd driven trucks before, so they figured he could drive a tank. The gunner had been a tractor mechanic in civilian life. He understood machinery, understood how to fix things when they broke. That made him valuable. The loader was 17 years old, a kid who'd lied about his age to enlist. And the radio operator, well, the radio operator probably didn't have a working radio, because over half the T-34s produced in 1941 didn't have them. Radio equipment was in short supply, so most tanks went to the front without radios. Commanders had to communicate with flags, hand signals, or just by following the tank in front of them and hoping for the best. These weren't elite troops. They weren't the Guards divisions or the veteran units. They were ordinary men thrown into an extraordinary nightmare. Factory workers, farmers, students, clerks, people who 6 months earlier had been living normal lives, and now they were being told to climb into a 30-ton war machine and fight the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. Their training was minimal. Most crews got maybe 2 weeks of instruction before being sent to the front. They learned how to start the engine, how to load the gun, how to read a map. That was it. Everything else they'd have to learn in combat, if they lived long enough. And their tank, 280, was about to be tested in ways its designers never imagined. The 21st Tank Brigade was sent to the Klin area in early December 1941 as part of the Soviet counteroffensive. Yeah, you heard that right. Counteroffensive. After months of retreating, of watching entire armies get swallowed up, the Soviets were finally pushing back. The German advance on Moscow had stalled just 20 kilometers from the city limits. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Their men were freezing in summer uniforms because Hitler hadn't planned for a winter campaign. He'd thought the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks, that the whole rotten structure would come crashing down the moment they kicked in the door. Now his soldiers were learning what Russian winter really meant. Temperatures that dropped to -30, -40 Celsius. Frostbite that turned fingers and toes black within minutes. Engine oil that froze solid overnight. Machine guns that jammed because the lubricant turned to paste. Soldiers burning furniture, books, anything they could find just to stay warm. The temperature in early December was hovering around -20 Celsius. That's -4 Fahrenheit. Tanks that had been unstoppable in the summer were now freezing solid. German Panzer IIIs and IVs used gasoline engines that wouldn't start in extreme cold. The batteries didn't have enough power. The fuel lines froze. Tank crews had to light fires under their engines just to warm them enough to turn over. And even when they got them started, the tanks were sluggish, unreliable. Meanwhile, the Soviets, they were built for this. The T-34's diesel engine could still turn over in temperatures that killed German gasoline engines. Diesel doesn't freeze as easily as gasoline. The fuel system was simpler, more robust, and diesel engines produced more torque at low RPMs, which meant better performance in snow and mud. The T-34's wide tracks distributed weight so it didn't sink into the snow the way German tanks did. German tanks had narrow tracks, designed for roads and firm ground. In Russian mud and snow, they became anchored. immobile. But the T-34 could keep moving. And the crews, well, they knew how to suffer. They'd been doing it their whole lives. Life in the Soviet Union in the 30s had been hard. Collectivization, purges, shortages. People had learned to endure things that would break others. Cold, hunger, exhaustion. These were just facts of life. So when they were thrown into the nightmare of the Eastern Front, they had a kind of resilience that the Germans didn't expect. They could keep fighting when anyone else would have quit. Tank 280's first engagement came on December 8th, near the village of Yamuga. The 21st Tank Brigade was tasked with cutting off German units retreating from Klin. The Germans were pulling back, trying to establish a new defensive line further west. The Soviets wanted to catch them on the move, hit them while they were vulnerable, disorganized. The plan was simple: move fast, hit the German columns on the roads, cause chaos, cut off their retreat routes. Simple on paper, but nothing was simple on the Eastern Front. The brigade rolled out before dawn, 20 T-34s and a handful of light T-60 and T-70 tanks. The cold was so extreme that some tanks didn't even make it to the starting line. Engines seized. Tracks froze to the ground and had to be broken free with hammers and crowbars. Batteries were dead despite being kept warm overnight. But Tank 280? Tank 280 started on the first try. The driver had babied that engine all night, kept a small fire burning nearby, checked the fuel lines twice. When he turned the key, the diesel engine coughed once, then roared to life. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The whole tank shuddered as the engine warmed up, and within minutes, they were moving. They moved through snow-covered forests, following narrow roads that were barely more than trails. The visibility was terrible. Snow was falling, thick and heavy, reducing visibility to maybe 50 meters. The lead tank was navigating by compass and instinct. No GPS, no satellite imagery, just a map and a compass and the hope that they were going the right direction. The interior of the tank was freezing. There was no heater. The crew wore every piece of clothing they had, multiple layers of uniforms, greatcoats, scarves wrapped around their faces, but the cold still seeped in through the metal hull. Their breath came out in clouds. Ice formed on the inside of the hull where their breath condensed and froze. And that's when they ran into the German column. Trucks, half-tracks, a few Panzer IIIs, all strung out along the road, trying to retreat. The Germans weren't expecting an attack. They thought the Soviets were too disorganized, too beaten down to launch an offensive. They were wrong. The Soviet tanks opened fire. The first German truck exploded, blocking the road. The column ground to a halt. German soldiers were jumping out of vehicles, scrambling for cover. Some tried to set up machine guns. Others just ran into the forest. The Panzer IIIs tried to turn their turrets, return fire, but they were caught in a terrible position, trapped on a narrow road, unable to maneuver, under fire from multiple directions. Tank 280's gunner put 3 shells into a German truck, blowing it apart in a shower of metal and fire. Ammunition inside the truck cooked off, setting fire to the trucks in front and behind it. The loader was cramming rounds into the breech as fast as his frozen hands could move. 76mm shells, each one weighing over 6 kilograms. He'd grab a shell from the ready rack, swing it up, slam it into the breech, step back. The gunner would fire. The whole tank would rock backward from the recoil. The spent shell casing would eject, clattering around the floor of the fighting compartment. And the loader would grab another shell, again and again. His hands were blistering from handling the cold metal. His shoulders were screaming from the repetitive motion, but he kept loading. The commander was screaming target directions over the roar of the engine and the crack of the gun. Truck, 11 o'clock, 200 meters. Half track, 12 o'clock. Panzer, 2 o'clock, moving right. His voice was hoarse from yelling. The gunner was swinging the turret, trying to keep up with the targets. The hand crank for the turret traverse was stiff from the cold. It took effort to move it. The powered traverse system wasn't working reliably in the extreme cold, so they were doing it manually. The gunner's arms were burning from the effort, but he kept cranking, kept aiming, kept firing. And then they got hit. A German 50mm anti-tank gun, hidden in the tree line, fired. The crew never saw it. never knew it was there until the shell hit them. The impact was like a sledgehammer blow. The entire tank rang like a bell. The shell hit the turret at an angle, right where the armor was thickest. The crew inside felt the impact travel through their bodies. The sound was deafening, a metallic clang that seemed to go on forever. For a split second, everyone froze, waiting to see if they were about to die, waiting for the shell to penetrate, to explode inside the fighting compartment, to turn them all into red mist. But the shell bounced. The armor held. The sloped turret armor did exactly what it was designed to do, deflected the shell upward and away. There was a deep gouge in the armor, glowing red-hot from the friction, but no penetration. The crew took a collective breath. They were alive. The commander recovered first, started screaming again. "Find that gun! Find it!" The gunner swung the turret, scanning the tree line, looking for the muzzle flash, looking for any sign of the anti-tank gun. There, a flicker of movement, a shape that didn't belong. He put the crosshairs on it and fired. The anti-tank gun disappeared in a cloud of snow and smoke and shattered wood. Direct hit. They kept moving. The battle was chaos. Soviet tanks were firing at anything that moved. German vehicles were burning all along the road. The snow was turning black with soot and oil. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The Germans who could were running, abandoning their vehicles, their equipment, just trying to get away. Those who couldn't run were surrendering, hands up, faces pale with fear and cold. That first battle lasted maybe 20 minutes. When it was over, the road was a graveyard. Dozens of vehicles destroyed or abandoned. The 21st Tank Brigade regrouped, counted their losses. 3 tanks knocked out. One had thrown a track and couldn't be recovered. Another had taken a direct hit to the engine and was burning. A third had been hit by a Panzerfaust and was immobilized. A dozen men were dead, another 20 wounded. But the Germans had lost more, much more. And Tank 280? Tank 280 had taken its first hit and kept rolling. The crew was shaken but unhurt. The tank was scarred but functional. They refueled, restocked ammunition from a supply truck, and prepared for the next fight. Because there was always a next fight. Over the next 3 days, they fought constantly. The German retreat wasn't orderly. It was a panicked scramble. Units were getting cut off, surrounded, wiped out. Command and control had broken down. Generals were trying to coordinate retreats, but communications were spotty. Radio batteries were dying in the cold. Phone lines were cut. Messengers were getting lost or killed. So individual units were making their own decisions, trying to survive, trying to get back to friendly lines. And the Soviets were pressing the advantage, hitting them again and again. Soviet doctrine was simple. Keep attacking. Keep moving. Don't give the Germans time to regroup. Hit them when they're weak, when they're disorganized, when they're vulnerable. Tank 280 was in the thick of it every time. On December 9th, they engaged a German armored column near the town of Vysokovo. This time, they weren't fighting trucks and half-tracks. They were fighting Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, real tanks with real guns and real crews. The Germans had better optics, better training, better tactics. Their gunners could hit targets at longer ranges. Their commanders had better situational awareness. Their radios actually worked, which meant they could coordinate their movements. But they were retreating, disorganized, cold, and demoralized. And the T-34s? The T-34s had momentum. They had the initiative. And momentum matters in tank warfare. The battle turned into a running gun duel through the streets of Vysokovo. Tanks firing at each other at point-blank range, sometimes less than 100 meters apart. At those ranges, armor didn't matter as much. Shells would punch through almost anything. It became about who could fire first, who could aim faster, who could move smarter. Buildings were collapsing from the impacts. Snow was turning black with soot and oil and blood. Civilians who'd been hiding in basements were running through the streets, trying to escape the carnage, trying to find anywhere that was safe. But there was nowhere safe. Not in Vysokovo. Not that day. Tank 280's gunner knocked out a Panzer III with a shot to the side armor. The German tank had been turning, exposing its flank, and the gunner caught it perfectly. The shell punched through the side hull and exploded. The Panzer III lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from every hatch. A few seconds later, 2 crew members bailed out, uniforms on fire, rolling in the snow to put out the flames. They took return fire from a Panzer IV, the shell punching into their front glasses plate but failing to penetrate. The impact knocked loose some equipment inside the tank. Tools fell from their racks. The radio operator was thrown against the hull, bruising his shoulder, but the armor held. The driver swerved, trying to present a harder target, smashed through a wooden fence, kept moving. Splinters and debris flew everywhere. They took another hit, this time on the tracks. The tank lurched, slowed, but didn't stop. The track held together, barely. One of the track links was cracked, another was bent, but the track didn't break. They could still move, though the damaged track made a terrible grinding noise with every rotation. The driver could feel it through the steering levers, a roughness that hadn't been there before. But they kept moving. They fired again and again. The gunner was in a rhythm now, aiming, firing, waiting for the loader to feed another shell, aiming again. His eyes were burning from the cordite smoke that filled the fighting compartment every time they fired. The ventilation system was supposed to clear the smoke, but it wasn't working properly in the cold. So they were breathing in gun smoke, coughing, eyes watering, but still fighting. When the Germans finally pulled out of Vysokovo, Tank 280 was still moving, but it was hurt. The front armor was scarred with impact craters, deep gouges where shells had hit and deflected. One track was damaged, rattling and grinding with every rotation. The turret traverse was sticking, the gears gummed up with something, maybe ice, maybe debris, maybe just the accumulated stress of constant use. It made it hard to aim quickly. The gunner had to really crank on the hand wheel to get the turret to move. And the crew? The crew was exhausted. They'd been fighting for 3 days straight with almost no sleep. Combat exhaustion was setting in. Hands were shaking. Reaction times were slowing. They'd run out of food. The rations they'd been issued were gone, eaten in the first day. Their water had frozen solid. They were drinking melted snow, which gave some of them stomach problems. And they'd lost count of how many times they'd been hit. After a few, you stopped counting. You just kept moving, kept fighting, kept hoping that the next shell wouldn't be the one that killed you. On December 10th, they were ordered to hold a position near a collective farm outside Klin. The Soviets were consolidating their gains, bringing up infantry and supplies. The tanks were supposed to provide cover, watch for German counterattacks, and rest as much as possible. It should have been a quiet day, a chance to catch their breath, do some maintenance, get some sleep. It wasn't. Just after noon, German artillery opened up. Not just a few guns, a full battery, maybe more. The Germans had pulled back, regrouped, and brought up artillery support. Now they were hitting back. Shells started falling like rain. The collective farm was bracketed, hit again and again. The Germans had the range dialed in perfectly. Buildings exploded. The stone barn collapsed. The main farmhouse caught fire. The ground erupted in geysers of frozen earth and snow. Shrapnel filled the air, whining and buzzing like angry hornets. The Soviet tanks scattered, trying to find cover, trying to get out of the killing zone. Tank 280 pulled behind a stone barn, the only solid structure left standing. The crew buttoned up, closed all the hatches, and waited for the barrage to end. But the barrage didn't end. It went on for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Shells kept falling. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar that made it impossible to think, impossible to communicate. The crew sat inside the tank, hunched down, hands over their ears, just enduring. Every shell that landed close made the tank rock. Debris rained down on the hull, clattering and banging. They couldn't see anything. The vision slits were covered with dirt and snow. They were blind, trapped, helpless. And then the German tanks appeared. It was a counterattack. A company of panzers, maybe 15 tanks, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns. They came out of the tree line fast, guns blazing. The Germans had caught them in the open, disorganized, vulnerable. This wasn't a meeting engagement. This was an ambush. The Germans had set this up perfectly. Artillery barrage to pin the Soviets down, then a rapid armored assault to finish them off. The first Soviet tank went up in flames within seconds. A Panzer IV put a shell right through its side armor. The T-34 exploded, the turret blown clean off, flipping through the air before crashing to the ground 20 meters away. Then a second tank was hit. The crew bailed out, running through the snow, trying to reach the tree line. German machine guns cut them down. The crews that could were bailing out, abandoning their tanks, running for their lives. And Tank 280 was pinned behind that collapsing barn with German tanks closing in from three sides. The commander made a decision. They couldn't run. The damaged track wouldn't let them move fast enough. They'd be caught in the open and destroyed. They couldn't hide. The Germans knew they were there. So they fought. The gunner lined up a shot on the lead Panzer, a Panzer IV maybe 300 meters away, and fired. Hit. The shell struck the German tank just below the turret ring. The Panzer IV stopped, smoke pouring from its engine. The crew started bailing out. But now the other Germans knew where Tank 280 was. They concentrated fire on the barn. Shells ripped through the stone walls like paper. The barn started to collapse, huge blocks of stone crashing down around them. Tank 280 backed up, tracks churning through rubble and debris, trying to get clear of the collapsing building. Another hit, this one on the side armor. It penetrated. The shell punched through the hull just behind the turret and exploded inside. The loader was killed instantly, cut down by shrapnel before he even knew what happened. The radio operator was wounded, shrapnel tearing through his shoulder and chest. He screamed, clutching at the wounds, blood pouring between his fingers. The gunner was hit too, shrapnel cutting across his face, blood running down into his eyes. But he stayed at his post, wiping blood away with his sleeve, trying to see, trying to aim. The commander was screaming for them to keep firing, keep fighting. He abandoned his position, moved to the loader spot, started feeding shells into the breach himself. His hands were blistering from the heat of the spent shell casings. The interior of the tank was filling with smoke and the smell of blood and burned metal. The driver was reversing, trying to get them out of the kill zone, trying to find any cover at all. But there was nowhere to go. The collective farm was being overrun. German infantry was advancing. Soviet infantry was falling back. The battle was lost. And the tank was on fire. Not the engine, not yet, but the interior. Something was burning. Maybe the padding on the crew seats. Maybe spilled fuel. Maybe just accumulated oil and grease. Smoke was filling the fighting compartment. The temperature was rising. The ammunition stored in the hull was starting to cook off. Small pops and cracks as the propellant heated up. They should have bailed out. Any sane crew would have abandoned the tank and run. But they didn't. The gunner fired one more shot, knocking out another German tank. Then another shot. Missing. The commander was feeding shells, hands burned and bleeding. They knocked out a second German tank, then a third. They were surrounded, outnumbered, on fire, but they kept fighting. And then finally, the engine took a direct hit. A Panzer shell punched through the rear armor and hit the diesel fuel tank. The diesel ignited, and the back of the tank turned into an inferno. That's when they bailed. The driver and commander dragged the wounded radio operator out through the driver's hatch. The gunner went out through the turret, rolling into the snow to put out the flames on his uniform. They crawled away from the tank, expecting it to explode at any second, waiting for the ammunition to cook off and blow the whole thing apart. The Germans were still advancing. Soviet infantry was providing covering fire, trying to help the tank crews escape. Machine gun fire was kicking up snow all around them. They crawled into a ditch, kept crawling, finally reached the tree line and relative safety. The radio operator died of his wounds that night. They carried him back to a field hospital, but there was nothing the doctors could do. Too much blood loss, too much internal damage. He was 19 years old. The gunner and driver were sent to a field hospital for treatment. The gunner's face was badly cut, and they were worried about infection. The driver had a concussion from when the tank had been hit. But the commander refused treatment. He had minor burns on his hands, some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. He stayed with his unit. He was reassigned to another tank within hours. That's how desperate things were. Crews were more valuable than machines. There were always more tanks coming off the production lines, but trained men, experienced crews, those were irreplaceable. The commander went back into battle the next day in a different T-34. Tank 280 was written off as destroyed. The Germans occupied the collective farm. Soviet records marked hull number 280 as a combat loss. And that, by all rights, should have been the end of the story. Except it wasn't. Because on December 12th, the Soviets counterattacked again and retook the collective farm. The Germans had held it for less than 48 hours before being pushed out. When Soviet recovery teams moved through the area, they found dozens of wrecked tanks, German and Soviet. Most were beyond repair. Burned-out Hawks, turrets blown off, ammunition cooked off, nothing left but twisted metal. But when they got to Tank 280, they stopped. One of the recovery team leaders walked around it, inspecting the damage. The fire had burned itself out. The exterior was blackened, scorched, covered in soot. The engine was wrecked, completely destroyed. But the hull was intact. The gun was intact. The turret still moved, though it was stiff. The tracks were damaged but repairable. And most importantly, the transmission and running gear were salvageable. See, this is something people don't understand about tank warfare on the Eastern Front. Tanks don't have to be perfect to be useful. They just have to move and shoot. The Soviets were masters of field repair. They had to be. They couldn't afford to abandon damaged tanks. Every tank mattered. So they had recovery teams that followed behind the frontline units, salvaging wrecks, stripping parts, getting damaged tanks running again. These teams worked miracles with almost nothing. They'd pull an engine from one wreck, a transmission from another, tracks from a third, and cobble together a working tank. It was brutal, pragmatic, and effective. And Tank 280, despite everything it had been through, still had bones. The hull frame was intact. The turret wasn't too badly damaged. The gun was fine. The suspension and running gear just needed some work. So they hitched it to a recovery tractor, a big tracked vehicle designed for hauling disabled tanks, and dragged it back to a field workshop 10 kilometers behind the front line. The workshop was set up in a half-destroyed factory building. The roof was partially collapsed, there were holes in the walls where shells had hit, but it was out of the weather, more or less, and it had a concrete floor where they could work. The conditions were medieval. No heat except for a few small fires, barely any light, just a few oil lamps and whatever daylight came through the holes in the roof. Tools that were worn to the point of uselessness, hammers with cracked handles, wrenches with stripped threads, welding equipment that barely worked, but the mechanics knew their job. They'd been doing this for months. They knew T-34s inside and out. They pulled the burned-out engine, a massive diesel V12 that weighed over 700 kilograms. It took 6 men and a winch to get it out. They replaced it with an engine salvaged from another wreck, a tank that had been hit in the turret and abandoned but had a good engine. They patched the hull penetration with a welded plate, cutting a piece of armor from another destroyed tank and welding it over the hole. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. They replaced the damaged track sections, pulling tracks from destroyed tanks and cutting them to fit. They cleaned out the fire damage from the interior, scrubbed away the blood, the soot, the burned padding. They replaced damaged instruments, fixed the turret traverse, cleaned and oiled the gun, and within 36 hours, Tank 280 was running again. It was assigned to a new crew, 5 men who'd never worked together before. A new commander, a junior sergeant who'd lost his own tank 2 days earlier when it had thrown a track and been captured by the Germans. A new gunner, fresh from training, just 2 weeks out of tank school. A new driver who had been a truck driver in civilian life and had only driven a tank twice before. A new loader and a new radio operator, both teenagers who looked like they should still be in school. They climbed into Tank 280, started the engine, and felt it rumble to life. They looked around at the patched armor, the welded repairs, the blood stains that hadn't quite come out, and they knew This tank had a history. This tank had seen things, and now it was theirs. They rolled back toward the front. The tank that should have died was going back to war. The new crew's first battle came on December 15th near the village of Krukovo, just south of Klin. The Soviets were pushing hard now, trying to break the German lines completely, trying to turn the retreat into a rout. Tank 280 was part of a company-sized assault on a German defensive position. 30 tanks, supported by infantry and artillery. They moved up through a frozen marsh, the ice cracking under the weight of the tanks, water seeping up through the cracks. The infantry was struggling, breaking through the ice with almost every step, but the tanks kept moving. German machine guns opened up as soon as they came into range. Bullets pinging off the armor, a constant metallic rattling. Then mortars started falling, explosions erupting in the ice, sending up fountains of freezing water and shattered ice. Then anti-tank guns. The Germans had set up a layered defense, machine guns and mortars in front, anti-tank guns behind them, and probably more guns and tanks further back. It was a killing ground, and the Soviets were walking right into it. Tank 280 took hit after hit. One shell smashed into the turret, right where the earlier damage had been welded over. For a moment the crew thought the weld would fail, that the shell would punch through, but the weld held. The Soviet mechanics had done their job well. Another shell hit the front glacis, the main frontal armor. The impact was tremendous. The driver's vision was blacked out for a moment from the flash, but the armor held. The sloped glacis did its job, deflecting the shell upward. A third shell hit the tracks, and this time the track broke. The tank ground to a halt, immobilized. The driver tried to reverse, tried to get the track back on the drive sprocket, but it was no use. The track was completely off, lying in the mud like a dead snake. They were stuck, and the German guns were still firing. The rest of the Soviet tanks pushed past them, leaving Tank 280 behind. Standard doctrine: don't stop to help disabled tanks during an assault. Keep moving, maintain momentum. Recovery teams will come back for them later, if there's a later. The crew had a choice: abandon the tank and try to make it back to Soviet lines on foot, or stay and hope someone would come back for them. Abandoning the tank meant a long, dangerous walk through a battlefield. German infantry could be anywhere: snipers, machine gun nests, patrols, and they'd be on foot, vulnerable. But staying meant sitting in a disabled tank while the battle raged around them, hoping they wouldn't take a direct hit. They stayed. For 6 hours, they sat in that immobilized tank while the battle raged around them. They could hear everything: the crack of tank guns, the chatter of machine guns, the crump of artillery, the screams of wounded men. German infantry probed toward them twice, trying to either capture or destroy the disabled tank. Both times the gunner fired canister rounds, basically turning the 76mm gun into a giant shotgun. Canister rounds were packed with hundreds of small steel balls. When fired, they spread out in a cone, devastating against infantry at close range. The German infantry backed off. They weren't willing to take the casualties required to overwhelm a tank, even a disabled one. And finally, after dark, a Soviet recovery tractor came back. It was dangerous work. The battlefield was still active. German artillery was falling randomly, but the recovery crews did their job. They hooked chains to Tank 280, dragged it back across the frozen marsh, back to the workshop. This time, the repairs took longer. The track had to be completely replaced. The turret needed work. The traverse mechanism was acting up again. The gun's recoil mechanism was damaged from firing so many canister rounds. Canister rounds produced more stress on the gun than standard armor-piercing shells. But by December 18th, it was ready again. Same crew, same tank, back to the front. Over the next 3 weeks, Tank 280 fought in 7 more engagements. It was hit by anti-tank guns, by artillery, by Panzerfausts, those portable German anti-tank weapons that infantry could carry. It was even near missed by an aerial bomb, a German Stuka dive bomber that dropped a 250-kilogram bomb that landed close enough to flip the tank onto its side. The crew was shaken, battered, but unhurt. They got out, and with the help of another tank, they pulled their T-34 upright again. The suspension was bent, one of the road wheels was cracked, but it still moved. They climbed back in and kept fighting. The hull was covered in patches and welds. Every time you looked at it, you could see another repair, another piece of welded armor, another replaced component. The original factory paint was long gone, replaced by rust and scorch marks and the black stains of diesel smoke. The crew started painting kill marks on the turret, small white crosses for German tanks they'd knocked out, small circles for anti-tank guns they'd destroyed. By late December, there were 14 marks. Other crews started to notice. That's the tank that won't die. That's hull number 280. That's the one that keeps coming back. You have to understand what this meant to the men who saw it. In a war where everything was falling apart, where chaos and death were the only constants, where you could be alive one second and obliterated the next, there was this one tank that just refused to die. It became a symbol, not officially, not in propaganda posters or newspaper articles, just among the men who fought alongside it. They'd see that scarred, battered T-34 rolling up to the line, and they'd think, if that thing can survive, maybe I can too. Maybe there's hope. Maybe we can win this. But survival always comes with a price. The crew was rotated out in late December. They'd been at the front for 3 weeks straight, living in the tank, sleeping maybe 2 hours a night, eating when they could, fighting constantly. They were spent. Physically, mentally, emotionally, they had nothing left. The human body can only take so much. Combat stress, exhaustion, malnutrition, cold, it all adds up. 2 of them never went back to combat. They were reassigned to training units in the rear, teaching new crews. They'd done their part. The commander was promoted to lieutenant and given a new tank, a brand new T-34 straight from the factory. And Tank 280 got its 3rd crew. This crew lasted 4 days. On December 29th, during an assault on the town of Volokholamsk, they drove over a buried German mine. The Germans had mined the approaches to the town, planting teller mines, anti-tank mines, under the snow where Soviet tanks would drive over them. Tank 280 hit one. The explosion was massive, lifting the front of the tank off the ground. The blast blew the front road wheels clean off, bent the suspension arms, and cracked the hull. The crew bailed out, all 5 of them, alive but shaken, ears ringing, vision blurred. Tank 280 was left in no man's land, halfway between the Soviet and German lines, sitting on a field full of mines and unexploded ordnance. For 2 days, it sat there while artillery from both sides pounded the area. Shells fell around it, on it, near it. By all right, it should have been destroyed, blown apart by a direct hit. But it wasn't. And then a Soviet recovery team went out under cover of darkness, hooked it up, and dragged it back. Again. They had to clear a path through the minefield first, crawling forward with mine detectors, carefully digging up mines and disarming them, all while German artillery fell around them. It took hours, but they got to the tank, hooked it up, and dragged it back. The mine damage was severe. The hull crack was bad enough that water and mud were getting into the interior, pooling on the floor. The road wheels were destroyed, bent axles, cracked wheels. The suspension was bent so badly that the tank sat at an angle. But the workshop crews patched it, again. They welded the hull crack, a long, ugly weld that ran for almost a meter. They replaced the road wheels with wheels from other wrecks. They hammered the suspension back into something resembling functional. It wasn't perfect. The tank rode rough now, the suspension never quite settling. But it moved, and that was enough. It took a week, but by January 6, 1942, Tank 280 was operational. Again, 4th crew, same tank, back to war. January 1942 was a brutal month. The Soviet offensive was running out of steam. They'd pushed the Germans back, liberated hundreds of villages and towns, killed and captured thousands of German soldiers. But they'd also exhausted themselves. Ammunition was running low. Fuel deliveries were irregular. Replacement crews weren't arriving fast enough. The tanks that had survived were breaking down from constant use. And the Germans? The Germans had stabilized their lines. They'd retreated to defensible positions, brought up reinforcements, reorganized their units. The easy victories were over. Now it was going to be grinding, attritional warfare. Tank battles became less frequent, but when they happened, they were vicious. Both sides were desperate, exhausted, running low on everything. Battles were fought at close range, often in villages and towns where tanks could barely maneuver. It was brutal, chaotic, unforgiving. Tank 280, now with its fourth crew, fought in 3 engagements that month. It was hit 9 times. It broke down twice, once from a thrown track, once from transmission problems. It got stuck in the snow once and had to be dug out by infantry. Soldiers with shovels spending hours digging away the snow while German artillery fell around them. But it kept rolling. By February, the tank was barely recognizable from the machine that had rolled off the production line 4 months earlier. The turret was pitted with impact craters, some so deep you could fit your fist in them. The hull was a patchwork of welds and replacement plates, different shades of metal showing where repairs had been made. The engine was on its 3rd replacement. The tracks were mismatched, one side from a T-34, the other side scavenged from an older BT-7 tank, cut and modified to fit. The gun had been replaced after the original barrel was damaged by overpressure from firing too many rounds too quickly. Even the crew seats were makeshift, cobbled together from wood and canvas because the original seats had been destroyed. The instruments didn't all work. The radio never worked. But it still moved. It still shot. It still fought. In March 1942, Tank 280 was finally pulled off the front line. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was falling apart. The hull frame was developing stress fractures, cracks in the metal from the accumulated shock of being hit so many times. The transmission was failing, grinding and slipping, barely able to transfer power to the tracks. The turret ring was so worn that the turret could barely rotate, and when it did, it made a terrible grinding noise. The tank had been in continuous combat for 4 months. It had been hit over 60 times. It had been repaired 12 times. It had been crewed by 4 different teams. It had outlasted dozens of other tanks. It had become, in some ways, more legend than machine. And now it was done. Senior officers made the decision. Tank 280 was to be sent to the rear, to a tank school, to be used as a training aid. It had earned its rest. So they loaded it onto a rail car and shipped it east, over 1,000 kilometers from the front, to a tank school near Kazan. The idea was to use it as a living example of what combat did to a tank. Show new crews what they'd be getting into. Let them see the reality of war, not the propaganda version. And it did serve that purpose for about a year. Students would climb inside, see the patched armor, the improvised repairs, the faint blood stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Instructors would tell them stories. This tank was hit 60 times and survived. This tank was abandoned 3 times and recovered 3 times. This tank fought for 4 months without stopping. Learn from it. Respect it. Understand that this is what awaits you. But then, in early 1943, the Soviets ran short of tanks again. The Battle of Kursk was coming. The Germans were massing for another massive offensive, the largest armored assault in history. The Soviets needed every tank they could get. Every factory was running at maximum capacity. Old tanks were being pulled out of storage, repaired, and sent back to the front. And someone, somewhere, looked at Tank 280 sitting in that tank school and decided it still has fight left in it. So they shipped it back to a factory. Not just a field workshop this time, but a full factory overhaul. They stripped it down to the frame, replaced everything that could be replaced. New engine, brand new, straight from the production line. New transmission, new tracks. New gun, a newer model 76mm with better accuracy. New armor plates to replace the most damaged sections. New instruments, new seats, new everything. When they were done, it looked almost new. Fresh paint, stenciled with hull number 280 again. But underneath it was still the same tank. The same hull frame, now reinforced with additional welding. The same turret, now with extra armor welded on. The same bones that had survived everything the Germans could throw at it. And in June 1943, it went back to war one more time. This time, it was assigned to the 2nd Tank Army, part of the Steppe Front. The crew was experienced now, veterans pulled from other units, men who'd survived months of combat, who knew how to fight and how to survive. They knew tanks inside and out, and when they saw hull number 280 stenciled on the turret, some of them recognized it. The stories had spread. Veterans talked. This was the tank that wouldn't die, the tank that fought at Moscow, the tank that was destroyed and recovered and rebuilt and sent back to fight. And now they were riding it into the biggest battle of the war. The Battle of Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million men, tens of thousands of artillery pieces. The Germans threw everything they had at the Soviet lines. New tanks, Tigers and Panthers with thick armor and powerful guns. New tactics, concentrated armored spearheads designed to punch through Soviet defenses. New determination, because this was their last chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. And the Soviets? The Soviets were ready. They'd built defensive lines kilometers deep, minefields and anti-tank ditches and fortified positions. They'd massed their tank reserves, ready to counterattack. They were going to turn Kursk into Germany's graveyard. And somewhere in that maelstrom, Tank 280 was fighting again. Records from this period are spotty. The battle was so massive, so chaotic, that detailed records often weren't kept. But we know Tank 280 was at Prokhorovka, the massive tank engagement on July 12th, where hundreds of tanks fought each other at point-blank range in a rolling, swirling melee that lasted for hours. We know it was hit at least 3 times that day. We know it knocked out 2 German Panthers and a Tiger I. We know that when the battle was over, when the Germans finally retreated, when the Soviets counted their losses and their victories, Tank 280 was still running. After Kursk, the Soviets never stopped advancing. They pushed west, liberating Ukraine, Belarus, driving the Germans back toward their own borders. Tank 280 stayed in service, fighting in battle after battle. By late 1943, it was one of the oldest T-34s still in frontline service. Most tanks from 1941 were long gone, destroyed or worn out, or rebuilt so many times they were essentially new tanks. But Tank 280, you could still see the original hull, the original turret, the bones of the tank that had rolled off the production line in October 1941. It fought into 1944, through the winter, through the spring, through the summer. It was hit, repaired, hit again, repaired again. The crew changed twice more. Men rotated out, new men rotated in, but the tank stayed. By late 1944, it had been in service for 3 years. It had fought in over 30 major engagements. It had been hit over 100 times. It had been repaired so many times that almost nothing of the original tank remained except the hull frame and turret casting. And it had outlived almost every other T-34 built in 1941. In October 1944, it was finally retired. Not destroyed, not worn out beyond repair, just retired. The war was moving too fast now. Newer T-34-85s with bigger guns and better armor were pouring off the production lines. The old T-34-76s were being phased out, sent to training units or reserve stocks. Tank 280, after 3 years of continuous service, was pulled off the front line for the last time. What happened to it after the war? No one knows for sure. Most likely it was scrapped, melted down, turned into steel for rebuilding the Soviet Union. The country was in ruins. Millions were dead. Cities were destroyed. They needed steel, needed metal, needed raw materials to rebuild. So old tanks were melted down and turned into tractors, into building materials, into new tanks. Tank 280 probably met the same fate. There are no museums with a T-34 labeled as hull number 280. No monuments, no plaques. The men who crewed it are all dead now, the last veteran passing away decades ago. The mechanics who repaired it, the recovery crews who dragged it back from no man's land, the commanders who sent it back into battle again and again, all gone. Just stories, stories told by veterans, written down in memoirs, preserved in military archives. The tank that refused to die. So why does this matter? Why am I telling you about one tank out of the tens of thousands that fought on the Eastern Front? Because Tank 280 represents something bigger than itself. It represents the resilience of the men who fought in these machines. It represents the Soviet ability to take punishment that would have broken anyone else and keep fighting. It represents the reality of the Eastern Front, brutal, chaotic, unforgiving, but ultimately survivable. Men died by the millions. Tanks were destroyed by the thousands. But some men survived. Some tanks survived. And their stories deserve to be remembered. Tank 280 wasn't special because it was the best tank. It wasn't. The Germans had better tanks in many ways. Better optics, better radios, better crew comfort, better tactics. Tank 280 was special because it refused to quit. Every time it should have died, it didn't. Every time it should have been abandoned, someone dragged it back. Every time it should have been scrapped, someone welded it together and sent it back to the front. It survived because the men who crewed it, repaired it, recovered it, they refused to let it die. And in a war where death was everywhere, where survival was often just a matter of luck, that refusal mattered. It gave men hope. It gave them something to believe in. If that tank can survive 60 hits, maybe I can survive one more battle. If that tank can be repaired 12 times, maybe my tank can be repaired too. If that tank keeps rolling, maybe we can win this war. The T-34 was a good tank. History has proven that. It was simple, reliable, easy to produce, easy to repair. It was produced in numbers that Germany couldn't match. Over 50,000 T-34s were built during the war. They overwhelmed the Germans through sheer numbers. But what made the T-34 legendary wasn't just the engineering. It was the men. The drivers who coaxed frozen engines to life at minus 30 degrees. The gunners who stayed at their posts while shells punched through the armor. The loaders who kept feeding shells as the tank burned around them. The commanders who made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The mechanics who worked in freezing workshops with inadequate tools to get one more tank running. The recovery crews who went into minefields and artillery barrages to drag back damaged tanks. Those men are why the Soviets won the tank war on the Eastern Front. Not because their tanks were invincible. They weren't. Thousands were destroyed. But because their will was unbreakable. Because they refused to quit. Because every time they were knocked down, they got back up. Because every time a tank was destroyed, they built another one. Because every time a crew was killed, they trained another one. Because they understood that this was a war of survival, and they would do whatever it took to survive. And Tank 280 is proof of that will. A machine that should have died in December 1941. A machine that was written off as destroyed multiple times. A machine that any rational person would have abandoned and scrapped. But it didn't die. It was recovered, repaired, rebuilt, and sent back to fight, again and again and again. Not because it was special, not because it was blessed or lucky or magical, but because the men who worked on it refused to let it die. That's the real story here. Not about a tank, about the people, about human determination, human resilience, human refusal to give up even when everything says you should. Tank 280 is a symbol of that. And that's why its story matters. That's why we're talking about it 80 years later. Because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when death is everywhere, even when survival seems impossible, people can endure, people can fight, people can win. The men who crewed Tank 280 were just ordinary people. Factory workers, farmers, truck drivers, mechanics. They weren't superheroes. They were scared, cold, hungry, exhausted. They watched their friends die. They experienced horrors that no one should have to experience. But they kept fighting. They climbed into that tank every day, knowing they might not climb out. And they fought. For their country, for their families, for each other, for survival. And the tank? The tank was just a machine. Steel and diesel and ammunition. It had no thoughts, no feelings, no will of its own. But it became something more. It became a symbol, a testament, a reminder that machines, like people, can endure far more than anyone thinks possible. That with enough determination, enough skill, enough refusal to quit, even a destroyed tank can be brought back to life. So when you think about World War II, when you think about the Eastern Front, when you think about the millions who died and the handful who survived, remember Tank 280. Remember that somewhere in that vast, brutal conflict, there was one tank that refused to die. And remember the men who made that possible, the crews who fought in it, the mechanics who repaired it, the recovery teams who saved it, the commanders who believed in it. Those men are the real heroes of this story. Tank 280 is gone now, scrapped, melted down, turned into something else. But its story remains. And as long as we tell that story, as long as we remember, that tank is still alive. Hit subscribe. We're bringing you real stories from the real war. Comment where you're from. Thank you for keeping history alive.